often we tell ourselves that we are keeping a secret from somebody we love because we want to protect them from knowing whatever it is, because it would hurt them or lessen their opinion of us or something, or cause some sort of pain. Like, that's often the story we tell ourselves.
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrzych.com or on Instagram at heathergrzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Sasha Vasilyuk, who is a journalist and author of a debut novel, Your Presence is Mandatory, which just got released in 2024, which spans between World War II and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Her nonfiction has been published in the New York Times, CNN, Harper's Bazaar, Time, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, and a bunch of other places. Sasha grew up between Ukraine and Russia before immigrating to the US at the age of 13. And her book is based on real events, and it's riveting. I've read it, and it's about a Ukrainian Jewish World War II veteran with a lifelong secret and the repercussions that occurred for his family and the grace that they find in the course of their survival. I think you're going to really love this book. I'm excited for you to hear from Sasha today. Sasha, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Heather. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So there's so much I've learned about the world since reading your book. Also, just, from getting to know you. And you've lived in a lot of countries. You live in the US now, but you were actually born in Crimea. And this feels like a really interesting place to be born because it doesn't seem quite clear. Is it its own country? Does it belong to another country? Tell me a little bit about growing up in Crimea, being born there.
Yeah, sure. So I was born in the 80s when Soviet Union still existed, and Crimea was part of the Soviet Union and at the time part of the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic. And it's a peninsula on the Black Sea, and it's basically the closest thing that the Soviet Union had to California. It's very similar in terms of climate. It's a big vacation destination for people. That's like where everybody goes to the beach. And in Soviet Union, you couldn't go abroad. And so Crimea was very popular. Most people didn't live there. Most people came there on vacation. And I was sort of lucky to have been born there because my parents worked there as young psychologists. And so it was just a fantastically beautiful place to grow up. Every time I smell thyme to this day, I'm immediately back in Crimea. It smells like pine trees and cypress trees and thyme, and it never snows there, or very, very rarely. It's very much like California, I would say. So it's funny that California is where I live now again. But it became the place that sort of began the war that we now have. In 2014, Russia essentially stole the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. And I hate saying this, but a lot of joy from the side of the Russians, primarily because it's a very nice place and a vacation destination that everyone loves. And I'm not going to go into like deep history of it, but it continues to be disputed as to who it really belongs to, as many things in the Soviet Union. But I haven't been there in quite a long time myself. We moved away when I was right before I started school. So my schooling really happened in Russia, in Moscow, and then in California. But I continued going there a few times afterward on vacation.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And you have deep roots in both Russia and Ukraine, and it sounds like it's been really challenging for you and your family in this war, and historically challenging as the novel that you've written is historical fiction loosely based on the life of your grandfather. And I was hoping, I want to ask quite a few questions today, but would you like to read from the book just to kind of get us into it?
Sure, absolutely. I'll read something short, but that has, given the theme of your show, that kind of has some bodily elements to it. This is not from the beginning. This is actually a scene towards the end, but it doesn't need any setup other than to say that Eupheme is our main character that we follow through the book, and he is based on my real grandfather. Okay, so here we go. Oh, and this is taking place in 1984. The next morning, Eupheme fidgeted with his hat. He sat on the wooden chair in the narrow subterranean room 104. His knees bumped against the empty wooden table. Above him, a yellow light bulb made everything look jaundiced. The officer who'd led him from the passport checkpoint down 2 flights of stairs along the corridor and into this narrow room had said Civil Officer Kislich would come soon to begin the questioning. But Eupheme had sat here long enough for his back to start aching. The room's dampness seemed to creep in through the walls. With his letter in the pocket of his jacket, Eupheme thought about fear, about how this place, its walls, its lighting, the very letters KGB, were meant to intimidate whatever lab rat was unlucky enough to end up here. Today, that lab rat was him. And though he knew that the waiting was intended to rattle his nerves, create confusion, and induce penitence, though he'd read enough illegal Solzhenitsyn to know their interrogation techniques, though he'd assured himself that in 1984 even the KGB were unlikely to sincerely believe in the bright future of communism, he was still afraid. It was as if they'd pumped a fear-inducing chemical into the room. And yet, as afraid as he was, a part of him was eager to finally let out his secret and beg that it never left this building. I'll stop there.
Ooh, gosh, I think anybody who's ever had a secret and feel like they have to tell their secret, that feeling that we all get inside. I mean, I don't know. I feel just even hearing that, my heart starts quickening. There's a lot of different things I feel in my body. But yeah, how would you say, because a lot of the themes of your novel are people having secrets and being silent about their secrets, and maybe also experiencing trauma and not talking about it, what drew you to write about those particular themes?
I think it's helpful to say that the novel is based, or the seed of the novel came from a letter that my family discovered after my beloved grandpa passed away about 20 years ago. He had left a letter that he had written to the KGB that described what happened to him during World War II. And the letter reveals like a very different picture that we always had of my grandpa. And it was a big shock to my grandmother, to my dad, to me, kind of to everyone in the family. And what I found interesting about that situation were 2 things. One, the story of how my grandfather was able to survive World War II, which is the reason I exist, is interesting in and of itself. There's a lot of adventure, there's a lot of mystery. It's sort of like if you're a novelist, it kind of has all the great juicy elements. He was like a cat with 9 lives kind of man. And so there's constant obstacles, there's constant survival. And so it's all built in there. And I thought it would make a great novel in and of itself. But psychologically, the more interesting part for me was exploring the silence that followed. So he was able to hide what happened to him for multiple reasons, to hide it from his family. And then for a long time, until the KGB caught on to it in the 80s, so like 40 years after the fact, from his government, from a very big brother totalitarian regime kind of government that liked knowing things about its citizens. And so I wanted to explore that silence and what makes somebody keep something from people he loves for such a long period of time, how fear and shame play into that decision, and what happens to that decision as a person ages, right? And as the country around him changes. So those were kind of the main questions and thus the main themes that I was working with.
Yeah. And this idea of us keeping things and holding secrets, we all can relate to that on an individual level where we've have things in our own lives where we maybe feel ashamed to talk about. And also, what's interesting about writing in your novel this way is that there's a kind of a collective shame and a collective thing that's happened in the Soviet culture because of certain historical events that I would say I was not really aware of before reading the book. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So, the one interesting quirk about the Soviet government that I didn't know about while living there or while living in post Soviet space and only became aware because of my grandfather's letter and because of research of this novel was how much people kept about what they survived from kind of their future generations. So, my grandfather is an example of it, but my grandma is as well. So, especially that generation, like that World War II generation, was very much kind of guilty of this. And it's the generation that survived the most traumatic things. So, it includes, if you're in Ukraine or other certain parts of the Soviet Union, it was a famine that was just killed millions of people. Then World War II, which killed 27 million Soviet people. And just in Stalin's terror, where also, I don't know the exact number, but also millions of people got sent to the Gulag, where a lot of them died. And then just general, like, fun Soviet things that often included periods of hunger and a lot of poverty and a lot of fear. But there were within this general population of people that age, there were certain people that had a very big reason to hide what happened to them. And during World War II, this included POWs, so prisoners of war. It included ostarbeiters, which means forced laborers. So it's civilians that the Germans carted away and used as forced laborers, and people that lived under Nazi occupation within Soviet Union. So like all of Ukraine, for example, was occupied by the Nazis for 2 years before it was liberated. So anybody who didn't evacuate and go east or something for whatever personal reason, all of these three categories of people were then, after the war, there was a big like suspicion cast upon them because they'd been exposed to the enemy for a prolonged period of time. So they were essentially not to be trusted. And their documents were marked in a certain way so that anybody who encounters them, so let's say an employer or somebody on the like admissions committee in grad school, something like that, would then know that these people are essentially second-class citizens. So after having suffered at the hands of the Nazi regime, they would then spend the rest of their life suffering in slightly smaller ways, but still unpleasant ways from their own country. And I didn't know any of this. This is not very well known, in fact, not just by me, but a lot of people are very surprised to discover this fact. And these people were kind of like written out of history in many ways. Soviet Union, and now Russia in particular, is very obsessive about World War II and about history of that period. However, all of these millions of people like don't make it into history books because they don't really fit the story being Soviet Union was this mighty place and a huge trauma was forced upon it by the Nazis, but then the Soviet Union kicked their ass. Essentially, that's like kind of the storyline. And these people that suffered from both regimes don't really fit it, right? So it wasn't talked about on a state level. And there was a societal shaming that was happening that then caused these people to also not talk about it like at home and to not then pass on this history to the future generations.
Wow. My grandfather served in World War II and he was stationed in the Aleutian Islands, I believe. And it's not something that he ever talked about. And it's not something that, I feel like it's really common for people who've served in the military to not talk about the things that they've experienced. And, they probably just want to move on with their life or whatever. I mean, I'm not an expert in that kind of life experience, but it's interesting, though, what you bring up about when we remember history, we remember a very specific top line story of it. And, obviously, because you're a journalist, you know all about this. So you know about what people remember, and then the fact that there's way more to the story. And I guess writing this book, because it's so personal to you in a lot of ways, even though it's not about you. And even though, I believe you've said in the past that the book is maybe like 10% based on truth, actual things and facts that and then the rest of it is fictionalized. And it was a creative endeavor on your part to fill in the blanks of a history that you couldn't learn from your grandfather. And going in doing all of that research, and from you being a person who had family in Ukraine and had ties to both Russia and Ukraine, deep ties, what was that like for you going through this process of writing the book? And what has it been like for you since the book launched?
Yeah, so I began writing this book not after we found this letter that I mentioned earlier, but actually 10 years later. I sort of wasn't in the right space to write at the beginning, and the topic didn't seem particularly urgent at the time. But then in 2014, Crimea got taken over by Russia, and then the Donbass, which is the eastern part of Ukraine, became like a separatist war zone. And it is where my family lived at the time, my dad's side of the family, and where I'd spend every summer. And in fact, like when I think of the word home, it is my grandparents' apartment in the Donbass that comes to mind first. And so what feels like my home became a war zone very unexpectedly, very quickly, and sent a lot of my cousins and nephews and stuff into refugee status. So this is back in like 10 years ago, right? And I got to go there to see my grandma and to see what this city that I used to visit looked like. And after that, I kind of understood why I should be writing this novel. And it also gave me confidence in writing it because I experienced, saw, heard, and smelled what war looks like a little bit. And so I started writing it in 2017. Right. So this is like 5 years before this full scale invasion and before the rest of the world learned where the heck Ukraine is. But until then, the way I identified was always a little complicated because I grew up in both of these places. However, I never learned Ukrainian unless you lived in the Ukrainian kind of language dominated side of Ukraine. A lot of people on the eastern side or in Crimea were Russian speaking. And so you learned, typically in that environment, you would learn Ukrainian at school at the time. And I never learned it because I was not there at school. So it's a language that didn't get passed down to me, even though it's what my grandparents spoke. And I identified pretty strongly with kind of my Russian identity, particularly after I immigrated. It was something that I kind of held on to in America, my homeland, my language. My dad stayed in Moscow. And so immigration was a very traumatic event for me. And I got pretty obsessive with keeping that part of my identity, especially the language. I always wanted to be a writer, and so language was always super important to me. Then I began writing this novel, right, that deals with kind of the Ukrainian side of my family. And I was finishing my last draft of it right when Putin announced a full-scale invasion, which kind of changed. On the one hand, it didn't really change the context because I'd been writing a book that takes place during World War II and takes place in the decades leading up to the Russia-Ukraine conflict as it was affecting the Donbass. And so for me and my family, this war was not new at all. Like we'd been living with it for, like 8 years, but it was new to the rest of the world. And of course, it was much more dramatic and much more tragic in terms of loss of life. It also became much scarier to identify with anything Russian, unless you really love Putin, and were like pro-war or something, which of course I wasn't. Like even the word Russian just became, there was a lot of shame that me and other people started to associate with that word, which is interesting because of course I'd spent the last 4 years writing about shame. So I don't know, it like came full circle in this weird way. Emotions that I wasn't writing about myself. I was writing about people in my family or people I made up who lived through this time. And then I was then facing a war myself and facing shame around my past or my culture myself as well, which is weird how life works like that.
Mm, that's really big, all of that. And I've always lived in America. I identify in some ways with like where my ancestors came from, but I'm clearly very American. And I think a lot of us have felt that feeling of when the government that you're associated with does something that you don't agree with or you think is horrible, even and inhumane and unjust, and dealing with that. And then going, say you travel abroad and you meet people. I remember, being abroad at times and not wanting to tell people I was American during certain periods.
I remember going to Egypt in 2003, and like they advise you do not say, if you can hide the fact that you're American, do so. And I did, because I had my Russian language. So I would just kind of pretend I'm like a Russian tourist. And they weirdly loved Russians over there, which I didn't even know. But yeah, the entire time I was there, I like never uttered the word American. So I could, yeah, it's a weird situation where you are a human being, right? Like sure, you vote maybe and you have your own personal opinions, but they might or might not at all reflect what the government under which you live does, which isn't an excuse. Because I think if we are talking about World War II, one of the things that comes up, if you read kind of journalism from that era, is that there were a lot of Germans that would say like, oh, no, 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 it wasn't us. We're not Nazis. Like, we're just living here, And so it kept being like the refrain, like no one seemed to be a Nazi in Germany, when the war ended. And so, of course, there's that example and that danger of feeling no responsibility or claiming no responsibility for your country's like horrible acts. I think right now, Russia's fate is being decided in that way because, yes, there's some people who are for the war. There's lots of people who aren't for this war because they didn't even know about it until it started happening. And there's refugees who've left Russia. But then there's also a lot of rhetoric on the Ukrainian side with the phrase, the shorthand of which is, there are no good Russians. So, yeah, I mean, it's a hard human experience to deal with and an interesting question to which I think the answer is complex. I think one thing that I've discovered in like researching this book and thinking about it and now seeing this like actual huge war happening in Europe again is that Soviet people did not do a good job dealing with their past and kind of claiming it. They wanted to just move on from the horrible things that happened, which is very much different from what the Germans did with their horrible past, right? Like it's this mantra, it's taught at schools over there. They're fully aware, they're not trying to hide from responsibility for what they did, even though it's now been like 3 generations after, right? Soviet people, same period, and that's not there at all. Like there isn't kind of a sense of responsibility on anyone's part. It was just like, well, the government did horrible things, and even though we all kind of participated, we're just going to blame it on a government that now doesn't exist. So now there's no one to blame. Yay, let's move on. That's like kind of how they deal with it. And if you don't deal with your own past as a person or, as a society, the present and the future are often in trouble, I think, which is what we're seeing, right? Like you kind of have to, I don't know. This is a question I think of a lot, like even independent of this book is, let's say kind of back to secrets. Like if you have something that you are keeping a secret, it's usually because there's shame that's associated with it, right? As you were saying. But the shame has like these two sides because often we tell ourselves that we are keeping a secret from somebody we love because we want to protect them from knowing whatever it is, because it would hurt them or lessen their opinion of us or something or cause some sort of pain. But that's often the story we tell ourselves because what we're really doing, of course, is like we're just protecting ourselves and not really protecting the people we love. And so I'm super fascinated with the psychology behind that. And I guess this book ended up being kind of an example of that same dilemma. But I think societally, it's sort of similar dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. There's this other dimension here. not to talk too much about Russia and Ukraine. There's enough that people have to hear about that in the world, but it always makes me think of the Bhagavad Gita. I'm going to call Arjuna the main character because I'm going to look at it as it's a story, but I know it's a religious text as well. But in the story there, Arjuna has to essentially go to war with his cousins and is basically told by, the deity in the book, like, you've got to do it. It's your dharma. You got to go to war with them. Like, because he's sitting there going, I don't want to kill my cousins. I don't want to kill my cousins. And I keep getting reminded of this when I think about Russia and Ukraine, and like the fact that you've bounced between these two countries depending on what the border is on that given day. And we're all a genetic soup of changes that occur across landscapes and time. And yet at the same time, we do this thing where we have othering, and that whole thing is so fascinating. And, I'm not an expert in war strategy. I've read The Art of War, but I know there are tactics and strategies around making people see other people as not human or less human than you or more bad than you. And that does seem to be like a common theme. And yeah, no one wants to say that they're the ones that are bad, that someone else is bad. And that gives us justification for going to war. That's really difficult stuff. I don't think it's stuff that we can fix, but we can tell stories that enlighten us about the individual human experiences and how we obey authority. And when there's conflict inside us with that bigger ideology that we're expected to follow or something like that.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's been a question that has come up multiple times, other interviews I've done, where I'm asked about my decision to not make all Germans bad with my World War II book. And it was a very deliberate decision because I have like a couple of bad Nazis there, sure, guards and such. But when I did research and I read a lot of firsthand accounts of survivors of like Soviet people who were in Germany, I discovered that often the way they were saved was from like one individual German person making a decision where they had the power. So let's say like a doctor could overlook seeing like a naked Jewish man, let's say, and overlook the fact that they were circumcised, so they must be Jewish, for instance, was something that happened. Or a guard who would just look the other way in a key moment. And this is something that I was never taught. I was very much taught history in a very black and white way, where like German Nazis bad, Soviet people good, or whatever, like very simplified and kind of black and white version. And now that we live in an actual war, I'm seeing that same dynamic in play where, yes, there's an othering, because that's the only way you can kill your cousin. Yeah, is if you stop thinking of your cousin as an actual human being and you other them and you make them part of like a larger category. This isn't your cousin. This is a representative of a bad people, right? And I'm seeing it now, right? This whole like, there's no good Russians refrain, which is their way of dealing with being attacked and killed and their lives completely destroyed.
Or saying that the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians are Nazis and they're trying to like paint that picture.
Exactly the same way as dehumanizing the other side, I guess, is the simplest trick in the book of war, I suppose. But of course, yeah, it is a very much kill your cousin kind of scenario that we have, which is, I think, what distinguishes this war from from other ones in Europe, or makes it similar to certain other ones.
Yeah. I know it's heavy stuff, but I will say that after reading your book, I got really fascinated with Stalin and, all the things leading up to Stalin, the Russian Revolution, and, just wondering in these moments in history, why do we not see the horrors that are about to unfold or the horrors that are unfolding? And why is it that some people see them and other people don't? And that is fascinating. What do you think about that?
Ooh. Yeah, it's funny because it makes me think of Americans. I think Americans right now, a lot of them, or maybe on both sides of like the political divide, I would say they're probably scared that the other side will win and horrible things will happen. And I think that's a very useful tool that works very well on the internet and works generally. Like, I mean, propaganda was always a tool, right? It's now just done faster and using AI or whatever, but it's the same kind of idea. And fear was always like a huge part of propagandizing any idea and making the other side be scared. Like, kind of back to othering, I suppose. And I think some people are able to see through that, through like the bullshit of it, but most people aren't. I think fear is such a strong, you probably know a lot about this from Ayurveda, but it's like, I don't know, I feel like it's a very strong, very powerful emotion. And so it's much easier to manipulate it by people who are good at doing such things. And then it's easy to make somebody myopic by manipulating fear. And there's only a few people, I mean, a smaller number of people who are like immune to it somehow and who could just, I don't know, see through it.
Yeah. I'd love to know exactly what that is. I read a book a few years ago called Obedience to Authority, which is about the Milgram experiments, where they had people doing this fake testing, so you had to go in and pretend you had to act as a test taker. And if somebody on the other side of the wall got a bad grade or bad mark, didn't get an answer right, you'd have to zap them. You've probably
Right. Yeah.
heard references to this in the past. And it was really fascinating that the majority of people I actually read this when Trump was running. I don't know why it just really came up for me as important to learn about. And I think there were probably 2/3 of the people would keep zapping people, even though they knew they were hurting them, just because someone else told them to do it. And that telling them to do it was kind of coming from an authority figure that they felt they had to be listening to and obeying. And that freaked me out. And it seemed as if there was this piece about the people who didn't do it, because there were maybe, say, 30% of people in the study that didn't zap when they heard that people were, or they wouldn't zap all the way, because a lot of people would zap a little. Some people would zap all the way to the point where they heard the other person on the other side saying, I have a heart condition, I'm worried, like, or they didn't hear them respond anymore and they could have been dead on the other side and they kept zapping them. And it was people that had some sort of previous experience, either themselves or in their history, that made them empathize with the person suffering on the other side. So there's something about relating to another person's suffering. And that's actually why I gave up eating pork. Like, I saw this little pig one day. He had a little deformed face and he couldn't see, and he was like bumping into all the other pigs. And I empathized with this little pig one day. And I was like, I can't eat pigs anymore. I was like, oh, I've had times where I, felt like I couldn't get to where I was going and felt injured or hurt, or, it was just insane. So I really, yeah, it's a big topic and not easy for all of us as humans trying to live our best life. But final question today, Sasha, what does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
Oh my goodness. I am personally quite bad at listening to my body. I'm very much in my head all the time, I would say. And it's something that I feel like I need to work on. And that there was a period in my life where I was much more aware of it. And it was quite a happy period. It was like following a tragedy, but it was, when I think of like the post tragedy period of traveling, I traveled alone around the world, how much more I was aware of the body and letting it enjoy things. And I don't know, I felt like I was like, just, yeah, living kind of like a separate life from the rest of the humans around me often because of it, I think, because I was like so attuned to the natural world around me, to like the smells, the air, my own body walking and stuff. Working as a writer, I think it's so hard to do that for me because you're constantly in your head, even when you're not writing. Writing is a very, the body is very much not involved. You're sitting there, but it's constantly in your head. And I've noticed one thing is that I think really best. Like I'm most creative when I'm in the shower. So there's something about the power of warm water that, and maybe just water. I think I'm kind of a water person that like clearly releases something, creativity. Anyway, so yeah, I think wisdom of the body for me is it's an aspiration and something that I don't know, I wish I had more of. I admire you. I feel like you're somebody who reminds me of being aware of the body. You always ask me things about the body when all I think about is, I don't know, thoughts and stuff in the head. So,
All right. Well, I definitely relate to that a lot. I think even those of us who talk about the body still feel caught up in our heads all the time because these thoughts are incessant, aren't they? And I really appreciate you being here. I love your book. I love you. And I recommend your book highly to all the listeners. Your Presence is Mandatory, which is a novel by Sasha Vasilyuk. Thank you so much for being here today, Sasha. And please let the audience know how they can find your book and get in touch with you.
yeah, thanks, Heather, for having me. This was great. I'm going to spell my last name just because it's a funny one. But if you Google me, I'm the only one with this name. And so my website and all my socials come up with that. So Sasha is spelled kind of a Sasha, but my last name is Vasilyuk. And if you hear the show and connect with me, please say hi and tell me that you heard about me from Heather. That would be awesome.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Heather.
If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. You want a full human experience when you seek a healthcare provider, and you don't want 15 minutes with someone who can't even try to find out the root cause of things because they're so overwhelmed themselves. You have a body, a mind, a heart, and dare I say it, even emotions. You're not crazy. Everything does affect you, and it's possible to feel better if you have the support you need. Set up an appointment with me to heal naturally. Go to heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.